Last year I took down World at War on Veteran difficulty, which I think it's pretty fair to say is generally considered to be the hardest of the Call of Duty games, or so I thought, because that clearly wasn't enough to impress some, with comments saying that World at War isn't actually that hard compared to Call of Duty 2, and if I want a real challenge, I need to play that. And you know what? They might just be onto something. I'll say it right now, this game is not fun on Veteran. In fact, I found it to be quite the opposite of fun, but here we are in the name of achievements and content. Think of this as me doing it so you don't have to, and if you've already done it, then I can truly say that I feel your pain. As a whole, the game isn't too bad. There are plenty of short missions that I breezed through, but they are far outweighed by some moments which are just complete insanity and really make you question why you're putting yourself through this. I truly planned on keeping track of the number of times that I died, but I genuinely had over 150 deaths long before reaching the halfway point, so I gave up with that idea. Dying a lot in Call of Duty obviously isn't unheard of. It doesn't take much to take you down on Veteran in any game, but there are a couple of things here that make it especially ridiculous. First are the infinitely respawning enemies. Again, this isn't a concept unique to Call of Duty 2, but here they're put in horrendously confined spaces which you're then forced to run into head first in order to progress. And there are plenty of houses throughout the campaign that will cause nightmares because of this. And I found the cherry on the cake of frustration to be the friendly fire mechanic. I get it, shooting teammates is bad, but sometimes you are sent back to the last checkpoint if what feels like a single bullet hits someone that shouldn't. And to make it even worse, sometimes they will just run out in front of you out of care in the world. And do I even need to talk about the grenade spam? And you can't even throw them back in this game either. And if all those things don't cause enough suffering, occasionally you will just get completely ruined by a checkpoint and forced to restart the entire level over again. Anyway, with all that moaning out of the way, I should probably get into the game. And the quick backstory to Call of Duty 2 is that it was released in late 2005 as a launch title for the Xbox 360, and to some very high praise. Of course it looks aged now, being nearly 20 years old, but at the time these were some pretty mind-blowing graphics. And the achievements are simple, 13 in total and all unlocked by completing the game on its hardest difficulty, but unfortunately, simple very much doesn't mean easy. The game is of course set during World War II. The story is experienced through the perspectives of 4 soldiers, one in the Red Army, one in the US Army and 2 in the British Army. And with these 4 soldiers comes 4 campaigns with a total of 27 missions, so a fair amount to get through. The campaign starts out in Moscow with the basic training mission, which pretty much serves as a tutorial, but with a bit of combat when the German forces invade. And of course, I couldn't forget the power of the mighty smoke grenade. These helped carry me through World at War, and they're once again a big help here. This was a nice stress-free level to ease me in, although I still couldn't avoid dying of course, but I did get my first achievement. The next level involves the destruction of a German outpost in Stalingrad. There was nothing too tricky here, a courtyard to get across, a counter-attack to hold off, before finally advancing towards and into the stronghold and placing the explosive charges. And once the building was brought down, up popped my second achievement. And at this point I'd unlocked the British campaign, but I stuck it out with my boys in the Red Army, and the following mission definitely started to up the difficulty. The goal here is to repair the field phone wire in several locations before destroying a few tanks with sticky bombs, and most of the level takes place throughout these partially destroyed buildings, so there was lots of slow crawling around corners and grenades being thrown. Luckily, the infinitely spawning enemies hadn't quite kicked in at this point, but the speed at which I'll die throughout the game was made very clear. After this, I was assigned to retake numerous enemy locations focused around a train station, starting with my team infiltrating through an unused pipeline. And the bulk of this mission is spent capturing a headquarters in the station house and then holding off the immediate counterattack. Once that was done, I had another tank to take out, and yeah, you should probably get used to these objectives because they are very repetitive. And finally, I cleared out the enemy supply dumps and machine gun positions, and the end of this mission did bring up my next achievement. And now I was over halfway done with the Winter War campaign and onto the 5th of 7 levels. The Downtown Assaults mission was the first time in the game that I started to feel anything close to being stuck. It starts off okay, clearing out a series of apartment buildings and an ammo stash, but this leads on to a section that I found really tricky, and this was also the first time that I felt the infinitely respawning enemies had started to kick in. The objective is pretty simple, just destroy yet another tank by planting explosives on it. The problem is the tank is circling around a courtyard filled with enemies that don't stop respawning and hunting you down, and the tank will also change direction to avoid you, while shooting through the walls to instantly kill you. And throw on top of that the fact that it's not unheard of to get a very unfortunate checkpoint, and I had one in particular which was really bad, spawning me literally a second or two before being pincered by 2 enemies, and I also didn't save any smoke grenades for this point. and it was just a straight up really bad time. But I did stay strong and get there eventually, only after dying about 30 times in this area though. And the next mission was a nice little breather after the previous two, which had taken me just over 1 hour combined. This one, however, was only about 15 minutes. And all I had to do was fight through the streets to reach the city hall, and that was nothing that couldn't be handled with some smoke grenades and slowly crawling around corners. And with that, I was on to the final part of the Russian campaign, starting with some close quarters combat, working my way through City Hall, and into Call of Duty 2's Sniper Duel. Anyone who has played World at War is probably having horrific flashbacks now, but this one is much easier. Either that, or I just got extremely lucky because I managed to take him down with one shot on my first try. And that leads to the final battle. You guessed it, one last counterattack to hold off. I'm sure this was designed to be a dramatic standoff, mowing down the incoming enemies from the windows, but on Veteran, that's not really going to get you very far. So instead, I just found the safest corner to cower away in and waited for them to come to me. I slowly watched the dots that represent my allies disappear from the map as they were hunted down, and in the end I just mostly patrolled this stair area, clearing out the enemies where I could. There were 3 waves to fend off, and there were some other objectives like taking out a vehicle and specific machine gunners, but I completely ignored those. And after about 15 minutes of trying, the mission was complete and I was done with the Red Army campaign. The Winter War was won. My attention can now turn to the British campaign, featuring the iconic Captain Price, looking a little more pixelated here. And the first level is a sneak attack on the German ammunition station, fighting through trenches and clearing out enemy bunkers along the way. Once at the depot, I had to destroy numerous ammo caches and fuel barrels before clearing one last bunker to retrieve some enemy intel, and there was nothing here to cause any issues. The next mission takes place on the same night. The division moves to a nearby town where allies are being met with heavy resistance, and the majority of this involves holding off waves of advancing forces. I tried to just hide in the corner and let it all blow over, but I was sent back for failing to protect the town, and plus the enemies were hunting me down here anyway, so it just didn't work at all. I did have success by taking up positions first in the trenches and then manning one of the mounted machine guns, although I did have a moment which really sums up this game and what you're up against. Just as I lined up the troops on the horizon and pulled the trigger, an ally ran right in front of me, getting annihilated and sending me back to the last checkpoint. And the final part of this mission involves marking targets for artillery strikes. I found out the hard way that enemies can climb this ladder here, so I had to keep an eye out for that. Otherwise, this section is very chilled. And at this point, friendly tanks have arrived for reinforcement, so we use them for cover to cross the desert and then begin the task of clearing out several tunnels and bunkers, as well as taking out the crews of the flak guns. And these ones here really made it hard for me. There were of course some friendly fire casualties along the way, but I wasn't the only one doing the team killing. And after clearing the last bunker, we moved on to take over a German communications centre, radioed to HQ, and brought up the end of the level. There was still a bit of work left to do in Egypt though, and more of the same here really, except this time, the trenches and open desert were replaced by a town and houses to infiltrate. These are just an extremely mild taste of what's to come later though. I can only say that I wish all of the houses in this game were as easy to clear as these ones. There's a fair few groups of enemies including flak crews to take out, but lots of cover and vantage points to make use of. After using enemy radio to call in air support, I fought through the city to acquire some enemy intel, and the boys celebrated by cracking open the wine on the port. This also brought up my next achievement. And now it was my turn to man a tank in 3 short missions. These all lead straight into the next and are very similar, riding around the desert, destroying enemy tanks or positions in the trenches. As it is veteran, you will still obviously die very quickly, sometimes seemingly out of absolutely nowhere, but overall, these are pretty easy. Just don't go rolling into the middle of the open areas and expect it to work out. There's plenty of cover to take, whether that be some terrain or the corpses of your allies. And sometimes it can be a bit tricky to see where the targets are, but they're marked on your minimap. Also, the pause menu will say what you have left to destroy, and overall, these were just easy, finishing up all 3 in under 20 minutes and unlocking another achievement. So it wasn't long before I was back on foot with harder missions to tackle again. This one begins in a building which is under fire from troops and an armoured car. In theory, I was meant to man a mounted machine gun and mow down what I could, but this is just a time sequence, so it's pretty pointless. Instead, I did what I do best, curled up in a corner and waited until I could move somewhere else. And once this door opened, we made our way downstairs into the street, taking out the gunner of the vehicle before hijacking it with me taking control of the turret. This next area is an on-rails section with the AI doing the driving, and all I had to do was spray bullets at everything in sight, which included foot soldiers, enemies wielding RPGs on the rooftops, and other vehicles. It's definitely more forgiving than similar parts in other games where if you don't take down certain targets pretty much immediately, you just die on the spot. And here there is a lot more room for error, and I had RPGs fired at me but miss, etc, so ended up getting through with no restarts. The car hits a mine eventually, which leads into the final battle through the streets and to the end of the level. Nothing here that can't be handled with some smoke grenades and making use of cover. Sticking to the streets of Tunisia, I fought through the town, eliminating several Flak 88 crews before capturing the final objective with a nice little flanking manoeuvre here. Although I was a little bit too twitchy on the trigger, luckily I just had a new checkpoint seconds before. Unfortunately, finishing this level with relative ease meant I was quickly onto the next mission, the start of which was the point that I gave up counting my deaths. It starts with your car being ambushed and you finding yourself on the ground right between two buildings which are just covered in German infantry. I think just playing some slightly sped up footage will get my point across better than my words ever could about the horrors of this section. I'm not 100% sure if the enemies instantly respawn onto the roofs, but it certainly felt like it. You need to be able to survive long enough for Captain Price to cut through a nearby gate, and in the end, to the surprise of absolutely nobody, I found my best tactic just to be throwing down all of the smoke grenades I had and hoping that it kept me alive until I could leave the area. In total, I only spent around 8 minutes on this, but considering I was dying literally every 5 seconds, you can probably see why I gave up tracking those. So after many deaths, I did make it through into the following courtyard. I didn't really notice at the time, but there are basically two routes, round to left or through the middle archway, which has a machine gun nest, making it the more difficult option. So obviously I went through the middle. And from there, it was just a slow push through an army of troops, on the ground, firing down on you from the buildings, basically just everywhere. A little bit into the level, some friendly reinforcements do arrive, including this tank, but they won't take out everything, so I still had to take my time, making my way through the streets, and that leads up to the finale of this part of the British campaign. Once the walls of this last courtyard were cleared, I had to man the gun and shoot down the incoming planes. And do make sure the walls are clear, because otherwise you'll just get shot and killed whilst trying to take down the planes like I did here. There are a fair few planes to destroy, and if any of them aren't destroyed by the time that they pass overhead, then you will instantly fail, which did happen to me one time, before happening again with literally the final plane. You can even see the dialogue appear to signal that it was all over, but the next attempt was a success, and I'd finished the first half of the British campaign, unlocking another achievement in the process. At this point, I would have been able to back out to the mission menu and continue the British campaign, but I chose to continue with the chronological order of the game and get into the American part of the story. This starts with probably the most iconic level in the game. When you think of World War II games, I think it's safe to say most people think of D-Day, and the mission begins with landing on the beaches of France under a hail of bullets, grenades and mortars, one of which knocks you down and launches a brief cutscene showing the rather sobering scene of the first wave of soldiers assaulting the cliffside. And obviously this probably hit a bit harder in 2005 when these were state-of-the-art graphics for the time. Once up the wall, we started to push through the trenches and bunkers with the objective of destroying German artillery guns which had been hidden somewhere in the nearby area. We fought further inland, clearing out the neighbouring village and made it to the artillery, destroying them with thermite before doubling back on ourselves. I also picked up a sniper at the base of the cliffs at the starter level, and that was very handy throughout as there was a lot of medium distance combat and enemies hiding behind walls or in windows. And whilst we were destroying the artillery, the enemies regrouped in the village, so next we had to carefully push back past the farm and through those, heading back to the top of the cliffs. The final objective for this level is clearing out the remaining 3 bunkers, and I had to take this bit really slow and make use of the terrain because being out in the open is certain death. And when the area was clear, the mission was done. And I've read online that this is considered to be one of the hardest in the game, but I personally didn't really feel like that was the case. It took me a little bit of time, but at no point did I really feel like I'd hit a wall. The next level starts at the crossroads that I passed through on the way to destroying the guns in the previous. Surrounded by a ton of enemy troops, the objective throughout is just to hold off the attacking forces, slowly retreating back through the orchard, town and the beach whilst waiting for reinforcements. There's somewhere around 4 or 5 spots you're forced to defend before being given the orders to fall back further, and it ends up in the bunkers at the cliffs. Here I of course tried to find the safest corner to back myself into and wait for the timer to count down. I was then able to deploy some green smoke to help my allies with their bombing of the area, and that was another level ticked off. This leads into the silo mission, which takes place a month or so later, and just now I mentioned how I disagree with some saying that D-Day is one of the hardest. This one, however, this I found to be comfortably one of the worst in the game. And to be honest, I'd probably go as far as to say the number one worst, because I actually started it, gave up, and didn't come back to it for nearly half a year later. That's how traumatized I was. There's a small field to get across, which leads into a town harbouring a ton of enemy infantry, and lots of lovely small buildings that need to be cleared out of their infinitely respawning troops. And these can be tackled in any order that you choose, but checkpoints are only awarded after each building is cleared, leading to some really painful gameplay. Sometimes it's hard enough just getting across the street into the next building, and that's before even attempting the charge headfirst into the infinitely respawning enemies to clear them out. I've got a good example here of what the problem is. There are two rooms literally either side of this doorway, and sitting out here means that enemies will just keep running out at you until the end of time. So you have no choice but to just cross your fingers and blindly run into a room, hoping you kill whatever is in there before it kills you and that nothing kills you from behind. And all 6 of the buildings are pretty much the same deal. I probably can't even do justice to how annoying I found this whole area. I mixed it up by trying to capture different objectives first, eventually managing to get the barn, and with that my first new checkpoint. And that clearly gave me a much needed morale boost because I went back to the farmhouse and cleared that out on the first attempt this time. And that, however, would be the last progress I'd be making for a long time, because after another 30 minutes or so of banging my head against a wall, I decided to take a break. And I didn't exactly expect the break to be something like 6 months, but here we are. I knew when I picked it up again that I couldn't be defeated a second time and I had to stay strong, and I managed to capture the manor house within 10 minutes or so, chucking grenades into the upper rooms which startles the enemies enough to get the advantage, and unfortunately my grenades weren't always well placed though. And it was at this point the friendly fire mechanic started to become the bane of my existence. There is one house in particular that was just absolute chaos. There were multiple entrances, windows everywhere, enemies running at me from all directions, leaving me extremely on edge because even just getting inside was hard enough. So then throw into the mix the occasional ally who just runs straight across, and what am I going to do? Obviously shoot at them, and we all know what happens then. So yeah, this bit had me pulling my hair out, but after another 20 minutes or so, I'd captured it, leaving just 2 to go. And just like before, that obviously gave me renewed confidence because I took down the next house very quickly, and that meant I only had the post office left. And this has the potential to be extremely annoying because just like the example I gave before, it has 2 rooms either side the top of the stairs. But thanks to some divine intervention, I actually managed to flush everything out with just grenades and I didn't even have to push all the way up. And clearly the game felt that I'd suffered enough at this point. The final objective is defending the area from a counterattack by sniping from a partially destroyed silo. This involves taking out mortar crews before they fire at you, and the minimap will mark where they are setting up, which gives you a bit of time to react, but there are quite a lot to deal with. Now I've actually completed this game before a few years ago, and at this point I basically got a game-breaking checkpoint. My checkpoint was genuinely as a mortar was about to land on my head, and there was absolutely nothing I could do, and in the end I had to restart the entire level and do all of those houses again. At least now enough time has passed I can look back at it and laugh, although I do wish I had it recorded. Luckily this time nothing quite that bad happened, although I did have one checkpoint that required some pretty quick shooting. I finished up the first part of the American campaign, and with that, one of the worst parts of the game was now behind me. So back into the shoes of the British Army I went to finish that campaign. The division is now in France and the mission is to rescue some American prisoners of war. We made our way into the town, clearing out resistance along the way before coming under heavy mortar fire, so our next job was to eliminate 2 mortar crews. And once we found the prisoners, we needed a way to transport them, but conveniently there was a German truck chilling nearby. I had to do some drive-by shooting, including taking out a tank that appears, but once the short ride was over, I was on to the next level without any trouble. With the prisoners rescued, we moved to the next town and were tasked with securing a crossroads so the convoy could advance. There are a few houses to clear here and troops manning mounted machine guns, but nothing anywhere near as painful as the silo. A Tiger tank appears around this time, but that was light work with a rocket launcher, and then once at the crossroads we had to drive back some enemy infantry. There's a very conveniently placed window here to shoot from. The final part of the mission takes place in the barn, and once we'd captured it there was a counter-attack to hold off which was broken into 5 waves, but it basically just blends all into one. I took up a position upstairs in the barn, and again there is a mounted gun, but it makes you a bit of a sitting duck, especially on veteran difficulty, so I mostly just peeked through the windows taking out what I could. And just when it was looking like all hope was lost, in comes the RAF to save the day. and we regrouped at the crossroads to escort the convoy to the next town, which also signals the start of the next level. And if the silo isn't the worst one, then this certainly is. But I find it hard to give it the top spot considering I didn't need to take an extended break from the game because of it. I was actually looking at the wiki to jog my mind about what each level contains, and this is the only one that I noticed having an actual warning before the walkthrough, so that must mean something. It's basically the same level, just reskinned. There are 5 objectives to secure and you'll get a new checkpoint for each one. These are the town hall, the post office, the flat gun, the church, and the headquarters. And to be completely honest, I'm not really sure what else I can add at this point that I haven't already said. I didn't have much fun here. In total, it took about 1 hour for me to clear all these objectives, and nearly half of that was spent on the last one, the headquarters. And honestly, if I didn't save a smoke grenade, I probably would still be trying to get it done right now. It's a tiny house that manages to hold hundreds of enemy infantry, and I didn't particularly have a plan. Just throw grenades to cause some chaos and choose the right moments to push up the stairs or into the rooms, and other than that, I just crossed my fingers, and to my relief, I did eventually get it done. Sadly, the difficult missions don't stop here. I had one final thing left to do in the British campaign. As has been made perfectly clear by this point, the objectives are rather repetitive, so we're tasked with taking one last field headquarters. But first, there are a couple of mortar teams to eliminate on our way through the town. Now, capturing the HQ isn't much of a problem. It's the bit that comes after that got the stress levels rising again. Naturally, there is a counter-attack to hold off, but this time to end the level you need to push back across the field, through the infantry and plant explosives on the tank sitting just behind this low wall. Sadly, getting across the field isn't enough to earn a checkpoint, even though that's a challenge in itself, so half the time I wasn't even making it to the wall before dying. And then when I did get close to the tank, I was killed by either the tank itself or a sneaky foot soldier lurking near these boxes. For whatever reason, I tried over and over again just going down the right hand side and obviously not getting it done, and then I decided maybe I should try to the left, and wouldn't you know it, that first try I made it round the back of the tank. This was still scary as a hail of grenades kept flying towards me and the tank stared me down, but thankfully any damage I did take wasn't quite enough to take me down, and I used these craters in the ground as a bit of mild cover. I managed to get the explosives on the tank and destroy it whilst living to tell the tale, but just to cause one last minor piece of annoyance, my video capture played up, so the footage is frozen here, but that was a small price to pay. And speaking of price, this is the last we'll be seeing of him because that was the British campaign all done and another achievement closer to completion. At this point I only had a few achievements left to unlock and they all came from finishing the American part of the story. The objective of these 3 missions is to capture Hill 400, a bunker sitting atop of, no surprises here, a big hill, and first we were tasked with clearing out the nearby town. There are of course multiple houses, but nothing as traumatizing as what came before, as well as a nice selection of machine gunners, a vehicle and mortars to deal with. Obviously there were a lot of deaths here, but I finished up by clearing out the enemy infantry from the church and surrounding area and moved closer to the end of the game. With the town under control, we can now start the assault of the hill. These next 2 levels effectively blend into one and are pretty tough. Definitely up there, the hardest in the game, and whilst they didn't cause me as much trouble as some of the others, they still took a while to get finished. There is a lot of stuff to get through. First, I was faced with the initial charge up the hill whilst watching everyone getting mown down around me, and with the objective of destroying 3 bunkers. I'm not sure if this is the only point in the game that the AI will actually throw smoke grenades themselves, but I was glad to see it, meaning I could save mine for later on. To be honest, the smoke isn't really needed here. It's not particularly hard, this first bunker. There are enough trees, holes in the ground and meat shields to get safely up. And once at the door, I used some explosives to get in and cleared the enemies inside. There's another smaller bunker just next to it, which is definitely worth searching for the sniper rifle. And from there began the slow push further up the hill. Luckily there is a ton of cover because death is near instant when hanging around out in the open, and the scoped weapon comes in really handy here for picking off the resistance, especially the machine gunners. There seems to be multiple routes to take to all the objectives here, and I found moving around to the left of the second bunker to be the easiest, reaching that and capturing it just as before. Now just one remained and the game mixes it up a bit by chucking in an armoured vehicle patrolling the area. Destroying this, as well as 2 mortar crews, are also objectives required for finishing the level, but I chose to ignore those until the bunker was cleared. This one is a little bit bigger than the others and I kept trying to rush clearing this last room, resulting in obvious death, but once I showed a little bit of self-restraint, I had it done. And then from the roof picked off the first mortar crew, maybe going a bit over the top of the grenade use here, and then I moved round to take out the second. There's also a rocket here which obviously comes in very handy for destroying the vehicle, but it's also possible to blow it up with a satchel charge if you can get close to it. This route worked out pretty well though, and that marked the end of the level. So just now I said that these 2 missions are up there the hardest, and what I really meant was this one in particular. It's basically just 5 to 10 minutes of surviving a massive onslaught of attacks and holding out on the hill waiting for reinforcements, but thanks to all the deaths, it actually took me about 30 minutes. And for this whole level you're locked into a small perimeter around the final bunker, and speaking of that bunker, I didn't notice at the time, but according to the wiki, if you attempt to just hide at the entrance of it, the game will spawn grenades being thrown in, even if no enemies are nearby, just an intent to stop you from cowering away in there. The first objective is to take out mortar crews attacking the hill. Similar to the silo, these spawn randomly and are marked on the minimap, but thankfully they're not as punishing here because you're actually able to move around and you're not just a sitting target. And once those are all dealt with, I had to take cover from the artillery barrage. This happens a couple of times and signals the next phase of the fight. There were only a few infantry to clear out and one vehicle before the next set of shells came flying in. And with that over, there was one last standoff to survive. A 5-minute wait until reinforcements whilst under constant attack from all sides, and a selection of vehicles and infantry to try either destroy or evade. It's not really possible to stay still because of the grenade mechanic I just mentioned, but luckily there is a very healthy supply of smoke grenades laying around, so I just threw those down for cover and hoped for the best. I did move to the bunker right at the end, and you can see here the absurd amount of grenades that instantly came after me, but that couldn't stop me, and once the timer reached 0, allied planes come in to bomb the hill, and I was rewarded with a nice achievement for my efforts. That meant I was on to the 27th and final level of the game. The objective here is to take the town neighbouring the river. After crossing in amphibious transport vehicles, we found the other side to be completely covered in mines, so we're forced to continue on foot. Now there aren't actually many parts to this level, they just happened to take me quite a while, nearly 1 hour in total. But at this point, my brain was already a complete puddle, and the game couldn't hurt me anymore. The damage had already been done. I think knowing I was so close to the end just kept me going no matter what I was up against. There were 5 artillery crews to take out, and the first 2 were no problem at all. But then I hit a bit of a roadblock and it took me about 20 or 25 minutes to make any more progress. I'm not sure what it was, but just getting around this corner to the 3rd gun was an absolute nightmare. There's not much cover to take and there are enemies firing down from the windows, and I think even if you take them out they probably just respawn anyway. But I struggled through, and once that was taken, the next came quickly after, and that led me into the final encounter of Call of Duty 2. The last flak is sitting just next to the square in the centre of the town, and the game very kindly sends in 2 tanks as its final challenge. Luckily there is a nice low wall to keep behind, and as far as I'm aware this can't be destroyed. The tanks can be blown up if you get close enough to place explosives on them, but it's made harder by the infantry also running around trying to gun you down. This was nothing that I couldn't handle though after everything that had been thrown at me before over the previous 26 levels, and once the square was cleared, my long and arduous journey had come to a close. The final 3 achievements popped, and I was very glad to be done with this one. You can see my first achievements were in July, and I didn't end up picking it up again to finish it until December. It was a bit of a mental battle, this one. Is it the hardest Call of Duty campaign I've done so far? I'm not sure. Each game seems to have its own horrific moments, and I find it hard to pick a standout, but it's definitely up there. As I said, on the whole the game isn't so bad because there are plenty of short and simple missions, but there are some points that are just crazy. If you put yourself through it, then let me know how you found it, and if there's a Call of Duty game that you think is definitely harder that I haven't played yet, I'd be interested to hear about that too. And other than that, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.